I've heard tales of the phantom hiker of Mount Rainier so often that when I finally decided to hike the same trails myself, I felt an uneasy mix of excitement and dread. The stories usually start the same way. A lone figure appears on the trail just at the edge of twilight, moving slowly, his face obscured in shadow. Some say he's dressed in old hiking gear, the kind you'd expect from a different era, with worn leather boots and a backpack that looks like it's seen 100 trails. One couple I spoke with, Sarah and Tom, were avid hikers. They had taken a lesser-known path, one that veers off from the main route just past a dense grove of trees. They weren't alone at first. There were a few other hikers ahead, but as dusk settled, the crowd thinned out and they found themselves isolated. Sarah recalled the moment she noticed him, just a flicker of movement up ahead. At first, she assumed it was another hiker, though something felt off. He was moving at an oddly slow pace, as if he were weighed down by something more than just his gear. When they finally caught up, she realized why the sight had unsettled her. His clothes didn't look modern. His coat was long and faded, with patches worn thin at the elbows. And there was an air of something sad about him. Tom, who had been leading the way, turned to ask if he was lost, but the man simply looked up, giving a slight nod, his eyes shadowed and distant. They walked together in silence for a while, feeling an unspoken camaraderie until, without a word, the man suddenly veered off the trail and disappeared into the trees. Sarah and Tom didn't think much of it until they reached a junction, where the trail narrowed and became steep. Sarah swears that's when they heard footsteps behind them. Soft at first, then faster, like someone running. But when they turned around, there was nothing. Just the whisper of leaves and the distant call of birds settling in for the night. They hurried back, shaken, but unsure what they'd just experienced. Later, when they shared their story with locals, they learned about the phantom hiker and his unsettling habit of appearing just before the path turns dangerous, as if guiding hikers to safety, only to vanish when they're secure. The most disturbing part of these encounters is the overwhelming sense of sorrow that people feel in his presence. It's as though he's trapped, his spirit wandering the trails he loved in life but cursed to relive some final tragic journey. Others say he could be the spirit of a hiker lost in the 1930s, a man who went out alone and never came back. He might have fallen in a ravine or succumbed to the elements, his body never found, leaving his spirit restless and searching. And yet there's this strange element of protection about him. He appears near precarious paths, near sharp drop-offs or confusing trail forks, almost like he's looking out for those who walk the same paths he once did. Another account I heard was from a solo hiker named Lisa. She'd been on the trail early in the season, just after the winter snows had receded. She'd camped out and was heading back when she noticed a figure on the ridge above her. She waved, thinking it was another hiker, but the figure just stood there watching her. As she moved down the trail, he followed, appearing every so often on the same ridge line, always just out of reach. When she finally took a break and looked up, he was gone. But in that silence, she could have sworn she heard someone whisper her name. It was just faint enough that she almost convinced herself she'd imagined it. But she hadn't been thinking of the phantom hiker then. Now she's convinced that he was watching over her that day, though the idea of it sends chills down her spine. Many people who camp at Mount Rainier describe a deep, almost tangible silence that settles in at night, broken only by the sound of the wind or the rustling of leaves. But there are those who claim they've heard something else, sounds that make the skin crawl and the heart race. They say the mountain echoes with something otherworldly, sounds that don't belong in the peaceful woods. One night, a group of campers set up in an area they thought was far from any trails, deep in the woods where they could see the stars undisturbed by other visitors. As they sat around the fire telling stories, they started to hear a soft whispering. At first, they thought it was the wind, but it grew louder, insistent, and unmistakable. It was like voices were moving around them, speaking just below the range of understanding. They strained to listen, to catch a word or two, but it was as though the voices were just out of reach. One of the campers, Sarah, said she felt something cold brush against her arm. She laughed it off, telling herself it was her imagination. But when she looked around, she saw that her friends were silent, eyes wide with fear. They heard it too. Then, Just as suddenly as it started, the whispering stopped. They were left in silence, surrounded by darkness, feeling like they'd somehow been intruded upon, watched. The rest of the night was a sleepless one, every small sound making them jump, every rustle of leaves feeling ominous. The next day, they packed up and left, but none of them could shake the feeling that they'd been surrounded by something unseen, something that had been there long before they set up camp. Another group, a family, had their own eerie encounter. They'd camped near a scenic overlook with a breathtaking view, far from any other visitors. That night, just as they settled into their tents, they heard a loud crashing sound like rocks tumbling down a cliff. Thinking it was an avalanche, they ran out, but there was nothing. No movement. No sign of anything that could have caused the noise. Then, from across the way, they heard it again. A piercing, human-like scream echoing through the valley. It was so clear, so real, that they thought someone was in trouble. They shouted out, trying to locate the source, but only silence answered. The sound lingered with them, an unnatural scream that none of them would forget. When they asked rangers the next day, they were told that, occasionally, people hear strange noises, possibly geological, or perhaps atmospheric. But this didn't sound natural. It sounded like someone or something in pain calling out from the depths of the forest. These echoes of the past, whether they're the cries of lost souls or just tricks of the mind, are part of what makes Mount Rainier so hauntingly beautiful. There's a mystery here, a sense that the mountain remembers every person who's ever set foot on it. Some of those sounds could be hikers calling out from the beyond, or maybe it's the mountain itself carrying their stories in its stones and trees, whispering to anyone willing to listen through the cold, silent nights. I've always been drawn to stories of people who vanish in wild places. There's something deeply unsettling about the idea of someone stepping off a well-worn trail, never to be seen again. And Mount Rainier, with its towering peaks and hidden crevices, seems to hold more than its share of these chilling mysteries. I've met people who swear that some disappearances here can't be easily explained. They say there are places on the mountain where, if you take a wrong turn, you could simply vanish as if the mountain itself claims you. One of the first stories I heard was about a young man named Jeremy, an experienced solo hiker in his late 20s. Jeremy was known for his skill, his respect for nature, and his cautious approach to dangerous trails. One summer, he decided to hike the Northern Loop Trail, a challenging but beautiful route that takes days to complete. He was supposed to check in with family every evening, and he did, until the fourth night. That was the last time anyone heard from him. When Jeremy didn't return home on schedule, his family alerted the rangers, and a search was launched. They found signs of him, footprints leading along the expected path, a campsite near a crystal-clear lake, even a small journal he'd kept documenting his journey. His last entry was simple, noting that he was tired but excited to see the next day's view from the ridge. Yet, he was never found. His pack, his tent, even his food supplies, everything was still there, untouched. It was as if he had just walked away from his belongings, intending to come right back. But he didn't. The search continued for weeks, but no sign of Jeremy ever appeared. He'd simply vanished, leaving behind a trail of questions that no one could answer. Some people speculate that he might have slipped into a ravine or fallen into an underground cavern, places so remote or hidden that they defy detection. But others think there's something more to his disappearance, something almost supernatural. Mount Rainier has this way of swallowing people up, especially those who wander alone, as if it keeps a few secrets of its own. And Jeremy's story isn't unique. Another disappearance that haunts locals is that of a young woman named Emily, who went missing several years ago. She was on a group hike when she became separated from her friends. They'd been descending a steep, rocky path, the kind that forces you to focus on each step, when Emily, who'd been at the back of the group, fell behind. Her friends paused to wait for her, glancing back up the trail, expecting to see her any moment. But when she didn't appear, they retraced their steps, only to find nothing. No sign of Emily, no scuff marks in the dirt, no echo of footsteps. It was as if she'd just disappeared. For days, rescue teams combed the area. They brought in dogs, helicopters, everything they could to try to find even a trace of her. The dogs picked up her scent near the trail, but it seemed to end abruptly, leading nowhere. It was like she'd been plucked right off the trail without a trace left behind. Her family, desperate for closure, returned year after year to place flowers near the spot where she was last seen, hoping that somehow she might still be found or that they'd learn what had happened. To this day, Emily's disappearance remains unsolved, a haunting reminder of just how easily someone can be lost to the mountain. And then there's the story of a man named Charles who went missing not once but twice. The first time, he'd been on a solo trip and somehow got separated from his gear during a blizzard. He was lost for 3 days before rangers found him, exhausted but alive, miles from where he'd started. The strange part was that Charles claimed he had no memory of how he'd ended up so far from his original trail. He described hearing voices in the storm, calling his name, guiding him to a cave where he sheltered. But when the rangers found him, there was no cave, no shelter, just open snow as far as the eye could see. After recovering from his ordeal, Charles became almost obsessed with Rainier, convinced that something strange had happened to him on that mountain. He believed he had been saved by some mysterious force, or perhaps even lured off course by it. Against everyone's advice, he returned to the mountain the following year, determined to retrace his steps and solve the mystery of his strange experience. That was the last anyone ever saw of him. His family and friends waited anxiously for him to return, but days turned into weeks, and despite a massive search, Charles was never found. The mountain had taken him, as if it had decided that his time had finally come. People say that some areas on Mount Rainier just feel wrong. Hikers report sudden, inexplicable chills, an instinctive feeling that they shouldn't go any further. A few believe these places are cursed, haunted by the spirits of those who have gone missing there. They talk about the Ridge, an area notorious for bad luck and strange happenings. It's said that compasses spin wildly, equipment fails, and hikers experience a strong urge to leave as if something is pushing them back. The Ridge is known among locals as a place where people have disappeared, only to be found days later, confused and disoriented, miles away from their original location, with no memory of how they got there. One ranger I spoke to mentioned a particularly eerie case involving a woman named Linda, who was found wandering miles from where she'd been reported missing. She'd been hiking with friends and had stepped away from the group to take some photos. When she didn't return, they searched the area and eventually called for help. Nearly 2 days later, Linda was discovered by another group of hikers, dazed, dehydrated, and unable to recall how she'd ended up so far from her friends. She spoke of strange dreams and a feeling of being pulled somewhere, though she couldn't explain why or where. When she finally returned to the trailhead, she was shaken and refused to ever go back, saying only that the mountain had called her and that she barely managed to find her way back. The more I've learned, the clearer it becomes that Mount Rainier isn't just a place, it's a presence, a force that seems to interact with those who venture onto its slopes. People who go missing here aren't just lost, they're taken in a way that feels almost deliberate, as if the mountain itself is choosing who stays and who goes. And while many disappearances can likely be attributed to natural dangers, treacherous terrain, sudden storms, hidden cliffs, there's something undeniably eerie about the patterns, the locations, the strange reappearances miles away, the complete lack of memory some survivors experience. In the end, it's as if Mount Rainier is a place where the boundaries between the real and the unreal blur, where people who step too close to the edge might find themselves slipping into something unknown, something beyond comprehension. And the missing? They've become part of the mountain's story, woven into its mists and shadows, their names whispered in the rustling of leaves, their presence lingering in the cold, silent air. Some say they've been taken to another realm hidden in the heart of the mountain, where they're part of something larger than life, something hidden and ancient, known only to those who've experienced it themselves. And as I think of these stories, I can't shake the feeling that if you're not careful, if you wander too far or stay too long, the mountain might just decide to keep you too. When people talk about strange encounters with creatures on Mount Rainier, I used to think they were just tales to entertain around a campfire. But the more I heard, the more I realized there might be something there, something wild, something unknown that lives in those dense, towering woods. The accounts I've gathered paint a picture of things that defy reason, animals that shouldn't exist, beings that hover at the edge of sight, always watching. always disappearing just as soon as someone tries to get a closer look. One of the most common sightings people report is of what they call shadow figures, strange, human-like shapes moving between the trees, often glimpsed around dusk or just before dawn. A man I met, a seasoned hiker named Joe, shared his experience from a trip he took with his brother one fall. They'd set up camp in a remote area, far from the more popular trails, and were sitting around their fire when Joe noticed something odd moving in the woods. It was just a flicker at first, a dark shape that seemed to shift between the trees, too quick and too quiet to be an animal they recognized. His brother brushed it off as a trick of the light, but Joe couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Later that night, they both awoke to a strange, rhythmic tapping coming from somewhere in the darkness. They shone their flashlights into the woods, expecting to see a deer or maybe a bear, but there was nothing there, just the trees and shadows. Joe swears that just beyond the reach of his light, he saw a figure, tall and thin, standing perfectly still, its face hidden, and then, just as he blinked, it was gone, melting into the night without a sound. They left at first light, feeling like they had narrowly escaped something they couldn't explain. Then there are the reports of creatures that don't fit any known description, animals that seem almost otherworldly. One woman I spoke with, Hannah, said she and her friends had encountered a wolf on the trail, except it was unlike any wolf they'd ever seen. She described it as unnaturally large, with a thick coat that was darker than the surrounding shadows. It had eyes that glowed faintly, a deep amber color that caught the light in a way she'd never seen before. But what disturbed her most was how it moved. It didn't prowl or slink like a normal wolf. Instead, it seemed to glide, almost like it was hovering just above the ground. When they tried to back away, the creature followed them, staying just out of reach. Eventually, they broke into a run, only to find it waiting for them at the next bend, watching with an unsettling intelligence in its gaze. Some people believe these sightings are connected to local Native American legends, which speak of guardian spirits that protect the mountain and its secrets. These spirits are said to take many forms, sometimes appearing as animals, sometimes as strange shadowy beings, guiding or, at times, warning travelers. There's a certain reverence among locals who believe in these stories, a deep respect for the creatures of Mount Rainier, as if acknowledging that they're not meant to be fully understood. I've even heard some rangers, usually grounded in practicalities, admit that certain areas give them an odd feeling, that they've seen animals or figures that shouldn't be there, watching from a distance before vanishing without a trace. Then there are those who claim to have encountered a creature that defies all logic, something that many describe as similar to the infamous Bigfoot. These stories have been around for decades, passed down from hiker to hiker, camper to camper. One older ranger named Pete, who's spent over 30 years patrolling the mountain, told me his story, though he admitted he's reluctant to talk about it. He'd been on a routine patrol in an isolated part of the park one winter, when he saw tracks in the snow. They were massive, far too large to belong to any human, and too unusual in shape to match any known animal. The tracks led off into a densely wooded area, and despite his better judgment, he decided to follow them. As he moved deeper into the trees, he said he felt a profound sense of unease, as if he were trespassing somewhere he didn't belong. The tracks continued, winding around trees and down steep ravines, almost like they were deliberately leading him off course. And then he saw it. A figure, towering and broad-shouldered, partially hidden behind a tree. It looked like a man, but it was covered in thick, dark hair, with arms that hung down almost to its knees. Pete froze, barely daring to breathe. The creature turned, looked directly at him, and in that instant, he felt an overwhelming urge to flee, a primal fear that made his skin crawl. Without a sound, the creature stepped back into the trees and vanished, leaving him standing there, heart pounding, alone in the silent woods. He turned and left immediately, never telling a soul about what he'd seen until years later, when he'd heard similar stories from others. But not all encounters with strange creatures on the mountain are so terrifying. I spoke with a couple who experienced something almost magical. They were hiking near a meadow at dawn just as the mist was lifting, when they saw a creature that seemed to blend perfectly with the landscape. At first, they thought it was a deer, but as they got closer, they saw that it had an unusual shape, with a slender, elongated body and an elegant head crowned with what looked like small antlers or horns. Its fur shimmered in the early light, almost as if it were made of mist itself. The creature seemed unbothered by their presence, watching them with calm, almost intelligent eyes before it disappeared into the fog, leaving them with a sense of awe and wonder. They felt as though they'd glimpsed something sacred, a creature not meant for human eyes, existing in a world just beyond ours. And then there are the stories that defy all explanation. One man, a wildlife photographer, was camping alone in the park when he heard what he described as whispers all around him. At first, he thought it was the wind, but as he lay there listening, the whispers grew louder, forming into words he couldn't quite understand. He stepped out of his tent, his camera ready, and as he scanned the woods, he saw something moving just at the edge of his vision. It was tall, thin, almost skeletal, and it moved with an eerie grace, gliding silently between the trees. He tried to snap a photo, but his camera malfunctioned, refusing to focus. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, filling his head with a sense of dread. He backed away slowly, retreating to his tent and covering his ears until the whispers faded and the creature vanished. He left at first light, shaken and unable to explain what he'd encountered. To this day, he avoids the park, convinced that he'd encountered something not of this world. These stories are just a few among many. People who spend time on Mount Rainier often come away with tales of strange animals, of figures in the shadows, of eyes watching from the trees. Some dismiss these accounts as tricks of the mind, illusions caused by exhaustion or the play of light and shadow in the dense woods. But there's something about the mountain that encourages these stories, something ancient and mysterious that seems to invite the unknown. Locals believe that the mountain holds its secrets close, and that every so often, it allows a glimpse of those secrets, a fleeting encounter that leaves those who experience it changed. I'm not sure what to believe. Part of me wants to dismiss these stories as folklore, as the product of imaginations fueled by the thrill of the wilderness. But another part of me, the part that's seen the awe and fear in the eyes of those who tell these tales, wonders if there's more to Mount Rainier than meets the eye. Maybe there are creatures out there that defy reason, beings that live in the hidden corners of the park, watching and waiting, leaving just enough trace to remind us that the world is stranger and perhaps more magical than we know. And maybe, just maybe, some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, but simply respected. There are certain spots on Mount Rainier that seem to have a weight to them, a kind of energy that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up the moment you step foot in them. It's as if these areas carry a presence of their own, places that demand respect and warn you, in their own silent way, that they're not to be disturbed. I've heard people call these places cursed or bad luck spots. Some say it's just superstition, that it's natural to feel uneasy in the remote wilderness. But others, especially the locals, believe these spots are different, places with a history, a darkness that's very real. One of the first spots people warned me about was Van Trump Park, named after P.B. Van Trump, one of the first recorded climbers of Mount Rainier. It's a beautiful, secluded area, high up and far enough from the main trails that it's quiet, serene. But something about Van Trump Park doesn't sit right with many visitors. I've met a few hikers who swear they'd never go back. They talk about an oppressive silence that fills the area, a quiet that isn't peaceful but stifling, heavy like something is watching from the trees, just out of sight. One woman I met, a regular on the mountain trails, told me about her experience there. She'd been hiking alone in Van Trump Park one late afternoon when she suddenly felt an overwhelming urge to leave. She couldn't explain it, but she said it was like the air had changed, thickened, becoming almost electric with tension. She picked up her pace, feeling as though something was following her, though every time she looked back the path was empty. And then, just as she rounded a bend, she tripped on a root she hadn't seen, landing hard and scraping her knee. As she sat there, trying to catch her breath, she heard what she described as a low, distant laugh, almost like someone was mocking her. She scrambled to her feet and left as fast as she could, never daring to look back. She hasn't returned to Van Trump Park since, saying she'd rather avoid whatever dark presence she felt that day. Another infamous spot is Carbon Glacier, an area known for its rugged beauty and the stunning views of the icy slopes. But people who venture there often speak of strange experiences, as if the place itself is hostile, as if it's trying to push them away. A park ranger I spoke to told me about a family that had come up to see the glacier one summer. They'd set out early in the morning, intending to make it back before dusk. But as they neared the glacier, they felt the air grow colder, not just with the chill of the ice, but an unnatural, biting cold that seemed to creep under their clothes, into their bones. The children started complaining of headaches, and even the adults felt nauseous. And then the whispers began. Each of them heard faint voices echoing across the ice, as if someone were calling their names. But every time they stopped to listen, the voices would fade, leaving them with nothing but the eerie silence of the glacier. They finally decided to turn back, feeling that something wasn't right. As they descended, they realized one of the children was missing his favorite jacket. They considered going back for it, but decided against it. They told the ranger later that they felt as though something had wanted them to stay, something that wouldn't let them go without taking a part of them. The ranger who heard their story admitted to me that he, too, had felt strange vibes at Carbon Glacier. "It's like the glacier has its own spirit," he said, shaking his head, "and it doesn't always like visitors." Then there's the Tahoma Creek Trail. Unlike the other areas, this one is less remote, but it's just as unsettling. People who walk this trail report an overwhelming feeling of disorientation. One man I met had planned a quick hike to the suspension bridge but found himself wandering off the trail, confused and lost in what he described as a haze. He'd been walking along the clearly marked path when somehow everything around him began to look the same. The trees, the rocks, they all blurred together as though he'd stumbled into a place that was out of sync with reality. He checked his compass, only to find it spinning erratically, refusing to point in any direction. After what felt like hours, he managed to find his way back to the main trail, though he couldn't remember how he'd gotten so turned around. When he reached the bridge and met up with other hikers, he discovered he'd only been gone 20 minutes, though to him it had felt like half the day. Since then, he's heard similar stories from others who've experienced this strange disorientation on the Tahoma Creek Trail. Some people believe it's the result of magnetic anomalies, while others think it's something more, something connected to the energy of the land itself. And then there's a place known among locals as The Rock. It's an unmarked area that doesn't appear on any official maps. But if you ask around, especially among the older rangers, you'll hear whispers of it. The Rock is said to be a large, solitary boulder hidden deep in the forest, a place where people who find it report intense feelings of fear, even panic. The few who claim to have stumbled upon it describe a strange humming sound, like a low vibration that seems to come from within the stone itself. Some say they felt it pulsing, almost like a heartbeat. The Rock has this uncanny ability to make people feel they shouldn't be there, that they've trespassed on sacred ground. One hiker, a guy named Sam, told me his story about finding the Rock. He'd been exploring off-trail, just poking around, when he came across this massive boulder nestled between some trees. At first, he didn't think much of it, but as he got closer, he said he felt this strange pressure in his chest, almost like a warning. The closer he got, the stronger the sensation became, until he could feel his heart pounding, his breath quickening. He said he could actually hear a low rhythmic hum coming from the boulder, vibrating through the ground. He didn't stick around to investigate. As he backed away, the feeling of dread lifted, leaving him shaken and wondering what he'd just encountered. He hasn't gone off trail since, and these cursed spots aren't just stories to scare hikers. They're places that seem to carry an energy, something almost alive. People say that the mountain has moods, and that if you pay attention, you can feel when it's welcoming or when it wants you gone. There are hikers who believe that Rainier remembers every soul that's ever walked its slopes, and that certain places hold on to the memories of those who never left. It's said that these cursed spots are where the past and present collide, where the echoes of old tragedies linger, caught in the rocks and trees, waiting to be felt by anyone brave or unlucky enough to step foot there. I once spoke to an elder from a local Native American tribe who shared his perspective on these places. He said that Mount Rainier is a living entity, with spirits that have watched over the land for centuries. These spirits, he explained, aren't malicious, but they're also not forgiving. They guard certain areas, places of power or tragedy, and those who trespass there without understanding or respect may feel the mountain's displeasure. These are places of memory, he told me. The mountain remembers, and it wants us to remember too. When you feel fear or sadness in these spots, that is the mountain speaking to you. Hearing that gave me a new respect for these cursed places, these dark corners of the mountain where fear seems to seep into the very ground. Maybe these places are simply reminders. Reminders that, no matter how much we explore or conquer, there are parts of the world we're meant to leave alone. And maybe it's these places that keep us connected to something ancient, something beyond our understanding. A reminder that the mountain is more than just a landscape. It's a keeper of secrets, a guardian of stories, and it doesn't give them up easily. So now when I hike on Mount Rainier, I tread carefully. I listen to the quiet, to the subtle cues that warn when I'm not wanted. And if I ever feel that chill, that pressing feeling urging me to leave, I don't question it. I turn back knowing that some places are meant to be avoided, left to their own mystery. The mountain, with its hidden power, reminds us all that there are forces beyond our control, that sometimes the safest path is the one that leads us away from these haunted, hallowed grounds.